Good morning, evening, or afternoon. This is going to be a little bit of an introduction into William Shakespeare and his works. So first of all, I'm going to give a little bit of interesting trivia about William Shakespeare, and hopefully it will help you know a little bit more about him. So he was born in 1564 in Stratford upon Avon, which is a small town about 100 miles outside of London. Shakespeare himself was not born into a wealthy family. His father was a glover and his mother was actually a farmer, or came from a family of farmers at least. Furthermore, it's unlikely that Shakespeare was even educated past grammar school. He married a lady named Anne Hathaway at the age of 18, and he had 3 children, Susanna, Hamnet, and Judith. While these children were still young, babies in fact, Shakespeare went to London to become an actor and a playwright. He joined a company of actors called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and he steadily rose in popularity in the world of theater. Eventually, in 1599, he opened the Globe Theatre with 5 other members of the Chamberlain's Men. After returning to Stratford, he ended up dying in 1616. And one notable line from his will is that he left his wife his second best bed. There's a couple of stories about whether that's out of malice or love, but that's, incidental. So let me go ahead and we will show the 3 main types of plays that he does. We have our comedies, our tragedies, and our histories. So the first one we'll talk about is the tragedies. Some of his most popular tragedies are Romeo and Juliet, Othello, Macbeth, and King Lear. Next year, we'll probably either do Othello or Macbeth, possibly King Lear. Not a huge fan of Romeo and Juliet, so it's unlikely. But these are some elements that are in all of his tragedies, or almost all of his tragedies. You have a tragic hero. This is a main character who is cursed by fate and possesses a tragic flaw. So something that they are ashamed of, or something that ends up leading to their downfall. Or maybe it's a trait they have, such as jealousy or greed, something along that line. There's typically going to be that struggle between good and evil. The main character is going to have to make a choice, and it's going to be a distinctly good or bad choice from the audience perspective, but it's going to be somewhat understandable due to the circumstances. Then we have a tragic waste. The good is destroyed right along with the bad in the resolution of the story. This is where we get that trope of everybody dies in the end from his place. And we will see that in Caesar for sure. Everybody dies in the end. External conflict. This is a conflict coming from outside of our hero, somebody who is not our protagonist, an actual antagonist. Then we have our internal conflict. This is that internal struggle that we have to face within ourselves, where he must overcome their fatal flaw. Catharsis. This is where you feel a sense of release because you're empathizing with the struggles that the character is going through. So it's sort of like when you watch a sad movie, sometimes watching sad movies makes you feel better because you're feeling what they're feeling. His tragedies tend to have supernatural elements, and this is the main distinguishing factor between them and their histories. They might have magic, witchcraft, especially ghosts. We'll see a ghost in Caesar. There's a lack of poetic justice, meaning things go badly for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're good or bad, life just doesn't work out for you. Then we have our comic relief. If you're watching something that's so dense and heavy, it's really important that there's something to break that up and make it not seem quite so down and upsetting. So those are the elements that are in his tragedies. Let's move on to his comedies. Now, they are lighthearted, but that doesn't mean they don't have substance and aren't worth digging into. Some of his more well-known comedies are Much Ado About Nothing, which is my personal favorite, A Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, and Twelfth Night. The common traits are going to be that mistaken identity. Typically, the characters are going to have to cross-dress or disguise themselves in order to reach some sort of goal. And that leads to mass confusion and chaos. And has this extra layer of humor because it's typically a man who's pretending to be a woman who's pretending to be a man. And the audience is aware of this, so it just adds that little bit of extra humor. Next, we have this idea of reason versus emotion. Rather than good versus evil, it's what's better, the head or the heart, logic or emotions. Then we have this idea of fate and the fantastical. Humans are just here to entertain higher level beings. They are playing with us in order to amuse themselves. Maybe they're placing bets on us, stuff like that. This one is particularly true in the play A Midsummer Night's Dream. Idyllic settings. There is often a distinction, a divide between the regular world and the fantastic world. So they'll start off in a city and wind up in a forest. And that in the forest setting is the idyllic setting. This, again, all of these ones aren't true for every single play as much as they are for the tragedies, but if you read enough of his comedies, you'll see these come up over and over. Separation and reconciliation. Often the lovers are separated, and then when they're reunited, everything works out fine. During this time that they're separated, they go through all sorts of chaos and hijinks and humor and everything like that ultimately brings them closer together in the end. Then we have our happy ending, and all the loose ends are tied up and everyone gets married. Typically, there's at least 2, if not more, marriages at the end, or weddings at the end of every comedy. Now, Shakespeare's histories are the ones that people often forget about. So they are very well known for the speeches that are within each of those plays. However, most people forget those in general. They tend to focus on Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream and things like that, and overlook these histories such as Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI, and each one of those, part 1, part 2, etc. So some of the histories have the following traits. They are almost always focused on English monarchy. They provide a social commentary on the leaders and class division. And most importantly, they're not terribly historically accurate. So they have that element. Now, a lot of people will question, why is Julius Caesar considered a tragedy rather than a history? Some of that will unfold as we go along. But one of the primary factors is that element of mysticism. We have ghosts in Julius Caesar, and that's extra not historically accurate. And of course, as it says here, Julius Caesar is not part of the English monarchy, so that wouldn't quite count. So now let's move on to talking about details of the play specifically. So it's important to be aware of not only the time the play was written itself, but also the time the play was set in, because there's lots of overlap. That's why this play is one of the more significant ones that he wrote. So this play was written in 1599, which, as we mentioned earlier, is the year in which he opened the Globe Theatre. And it was in London, which is one of the art and culture capitals of the world during the Renaissance. Queen Elizabeth had just taken the throne after Bloody Mary, also known as Mary Queen of Scots. And she was known for the brutal persecution of Protestants. She killed literally thousands of people during her reign. Her husband, Philip II of Spain, was the real head of the country, so it's been said, and Mary's often considered basically a puppet. Philip was set on reinstating the Catholic Church in England and pushing out that Protestantism. After Bloody Mary's rule, Queen Elizabeth was seen as a much stronger and better ruler. She ruled from 1558 until 1603, and it was sort of seen as a golden era. When Queen Elizabeth took the throne, she was pressured to get married, but she knew that this might make her a puppet like her sister Mary, and so Queen Elizabeth refused to marry. This caused England to become isolated from the rest of Europe, and it allowed Protestantism to regain a foothold in England, just like Queen Elizabeth's father, King Henry VIII, wanted. And if y'all don't know much about King Henry VIII and his history with Protestantism, I recommend looking it up on your own time. It's very interesting, but it's a lot to get into. So like I said, this was known as the Golden Era, the Golden Age in England, and other parts of Europe were not so ready to agree, though. The Catholic Church, for instance, was extremely upset that England was turning from Catholicism. So they excommunicated Queen Elizabeth and said that Catholics do not have to follow her orders. Many people saw this as almost like a call for assassination against the Queen, especially for those who opposed her. Then in 1588, Spain decided to try and take on England. The Spanish Armada, despite being considered invincible, was crushed by the faster and better equipped ships of England. It was also thought that God played a role in the destruction of the Spanish Armada because the winds against the Spanish made their ships, their attacks even weaker and everything like that. So it really worked against them. However, even with the success, England was still feared they still feared that there was going to be a second attack, or that there'd be a war with Ireland or France or all sorts of places. People were concerned and somewhat justifiably paranoid. This paranoia is what led Shakespeare to write Julius Caesar. He used this well-known historical setting of ancient Rome as a backdrop for the current events going on. So let's talk more specifically about when the play was set. The play is set in about 500 BC. Rome had become a republic and had two governing bodies to control the country rather than one, like there would be in a monarchy. There were the two consuls who would be elected for a year and a senate. So consuls, senate. However, as Rome grew its territory, the military leaders grew political power as well, dividing the power left. This divided the power, left the government susceptible to corruption. The more the power is divided, the more angles of attack you have to make it corrupt. So that's where our main man, Julius Caesar enters. I can speak, I promise. So he had a fairly interesting youth, becoming head of the household at 16 years old. He was kidnapped by pirates at like 20 years old. And then he killed them after his ransom was paid. And he had a few lower level governmental positions that held him, that he held, and he helped build them up. He ended up gaining a really good reputation and some debt. So Julius Caesar was determined to become consul, but due to this massive amount of debt that he had, it became an obstacle. So Julius Caesar turned to Marcus Crassus, who was known as the richest man in Rome, and asked him to help him out of this dilemma. Then Pompus Magnus, who was the heavyweight in the political realm of Rome, joined them, and they created the first triumvirate of Rome. These three gentlemen worked together to basically run the government and gain a lot of personal success. During his term as consul, Caesar used his political immunity to its full extent. Therefore, after his term was up, Caesar was not really ready to give up this power and immunity and everything like that. So he decided to instead become a political leader and further expand Rome's borders. For about the next 10 years, Caesar set about capturing everything. Specifically, he took over the Gauls and he made multiple attacks on Britain. As he went, he sent a lot of descriptive letters of his exploits back to the Roman people, which were read out loud to everybody. These letters were really useful in building the people's love of Julius Caesar. All they hear about are these great conquests that he's doing and everything like that, and it really helped endear him to the people. So when Crassus died in battle, Pompey knew that Caesar would become the primary threat to independent control of Rome. So Crassus decides that he is going to make a move against Caesar. Caesar decided, of course, that this was not going to stand. So he decided to make militaristic moves against Pompey. After many battles, including several that Caesar should have lost, Pompey was chased all the way to Egypt. While there, Pompey was beheaded by Ptolemy III, who was a pharaoh in Egypt. However, Caesar was not happy about that because he wanted to give Pompey clemency. That would have made him look really good to his people and everything like that. So when Caesar was finally done with Pompey, even though it wasn't the way he ended up conquering Egypt a little bit and then heading back to Rome. While in Rome, Caesar was actually a pretty good leader. He made a lot of really good reforms and advances for his people, such as reducing the country's debt, unemployment, and he allowed the Gauls to become recognized as citizens. It outlawed extortion, possibly primarily so others couldn't gain power the way he could, but that's neither here nor there. And he reformed the tax system, and he gave us the calendar that we have today, which is far more efficient than it was at that time. Then, after about a decade in power, he was named dictator for life, which made the Senate understandably upset. This led them to decide that Julius Caesar had to go. And then on March 15th, 44 BC, they stabbed him multiple times in Pompey's theater. The Senate members thought of themselves more as liberators than tyrants, but they deeply underestimated the people's love for Caesar. After seeing the people's reception of the assassination, they decided it'd be a good idea to leave town. And so as we see the play go through, it's going to be very similar to this, but it's going to have some differences. So let's talk more about the play itself rather than just the setting and the history of when it was written. The play itself was based on Plutarch's lives of the noble Greeks and Romans. And there's a lot of parts of this play, of Shakespeare's play, that rely heavily on the source. Sometimes they're really, really close to the text, and other times they use a tiny, tiny reference that's made until it creates a whole scene. Additionally, some of the events are sped up, so that way they can keep up that dramatic flair and everything like that. But he does his best to parallel the events the way they happened in England rather than the way they happened in history. So there's a lot of historical inaccuracies. So Shakespeare is also trying to parallel the fear of Rome returning to a monarchy, just like there's the fear of England returning to Catholicism. It also raises questions in Shakespeare's audience about whether or not a ruler should be assassinated for threatening the monarchy or republic. Shakespeare does a really good job of leaving up to the audience to respond to this question. Is it just? Think about this question as we read the play. Most of the puns in this play are, they're cobbled, they make sense, but some of them are going to be a little trickier. So keep in mind with that. But I do think it's important that you ask yourself whether or not you think Brutus is a good guy or a bad guy, Julius Caesar is a good guy or bad guy, and all these other elements as we go through. Your opinion might change throughout it, and that's totally fine, but try and consider those questions as we go forward in the play.